Here we are ready to begin our walk through the Gospel of Luke. Now, as I've said with Mark, and as we think back to our walking through Matthew, because I spent so much time going through the literary story, the narrative, and the plot of Matthew, for Mark and also for Luke here, we're not going to go through every single story because there's so much overlap. What I want to do instead is go through some highlights of what Luke contributes particularly to the gospel story. And in this discussion, we're going to focus on Luke chapters 1 and 2, and then a little bit into chapter 3 as well. Luke 1 and 2 are especially the prologue to this glorious book. Now, as we saw in our introduction to Luke in terms of introductory materials, I talked a little bit about Luke's preface, which is this kind of highfalutin Greek that posits Luke as being a piece of Hellenistic historiographic writing. It's a very well-written piece. It indicates for any reader of Greek, it's more complicated, that what he's about to do is give us a bios and history. And then I also talked about the fact that the way Luke writes, actually starting in 1:5 and beyond, is heavily influenced by the Septuagint in the way he depicts the events, particularly the idea of the promise being fulfilled, and also just the very Greek that he writes actually has a fair amount of that as well. So beginning in Luke 1:5 through the end of chapter 2, what you have is really like the prologue to a musical. Now, I grew up watching a lot of musicals, going to musicals occasionally, listening to soundtracks of musicals. And as I've grown as a gospel scholar, I've come to see that this is really what Luke has here as well. He's got this overture that sets up his whole book in a beautiful way. And it's not just an overture in terms of content, it's actually full of songs. In fact, these songs that are sung by Mary and Mary first, and then Zechariah and others, and Simeon, these actually become parts of sacred music in many composers' repertoire. They become pieces that are put to cantata and oratorio because they're pieces of poetry that are very easily sung. And so what you have in these first two chapters is, again, this, I think the best metaphor again is it's an overture. It's a way for Luke to say, here in this artistic and beautiful way, I'm going to lay out some of the main themes of what I'm going to tell you. Now, as we've seen, Mark, who is probably the first gospel, just jumps right in with John the Baptist. And we're going to meet John the Baptist here in a little bit as well. But Matthew and Luke, each in their own way, realize they can add something to what Mark has done. And what they add is really what's quite typical in a biography. You want to know something about the birth and the origins of the person that you're writing about. As we saw, Matthew really tells not so much about the birth, but about the early days of Jesus, his conception and then his childhood. And Matthew has a very clear point, which is to show, and which is really the beginning of the New Testament as well, how the beginning of Jesus' story fulfills all of Israel's story. Luke, again, wants to give us this early biographical information, but as I've said, his goal is more, I think, to certainly talk about the promises being fulfilled, but also to look forward to laying out the themes that are going to be in his gospel particularly. And so what you have in 1:5 and following are this series of stories that go back and forth between characters. In a lot of ways, this is more typical biographical information because they really are about the miraculous events that surround Jesus' conception and his birth, particularly with Mary and Elizabeth and Zechariah, who's the father of John the Baptist, as well as then Simeon and Anna, who are faithful old saints who see Jesus at his circumcision. And in these stories, you get a couple of really interesting things. First of all, notice the role of women. And this is something that I talked about in the introduction to Luke as well, that women play a particularly prominent role in Luke's gospel. And so too here, you have two very, very important women, Mary and Elizabeth. And notice also that Luke has done a very sophisticated job of highlighting the parallels between Jesus and John the Baptist, because these stories are really alternating. It's just a beautiful, I can imagine setting this to a play very easily, or to a musical, this beautiful alternation of two different birth stories that happen within a few months of each other, John the Baptist and Jesus, with the two mothers being highlighted as well. In fact, Zechariah's role in this is actually kind of the role of the doofus father, in the sense that he doesn't really believe and is struck dumb until John's birth, where Mary and Elizabeth are really portrayed as the faithful women here who play this role in God's salvation. And so the point of these two chapters, again, is aesthetic, and it's literary, it's musical, and as I said, it's also thematic or content driven. And one of the main themes that come out is that God is coming to restore his reign, particularly in the promise being fulfilled, that God would restore his reign from Isaiah that we've seen as we've talked about the other Gospels as well. And what you have particularly in this message of God coming to restore his reign in chapters 1 and 2, you have a lot of emphasis on the lessers and the lower and the unexpectedly outcast people being exalted. So you have the humble and the lowly being exalted to the place of highness. You see that with Mary and Elizabeth themselves, but you also see the promise that God is coming to do a reversal work where the lowly will be exalted and the high will be humbled. And so that, I think, is probably the quickest summary I can do on chapters 1 and 2 and what's going on. There's no substitute for just reading them and seeing the beauty of what they're laying out. In fact, a good assignment to do is to actually read these first 2 chapters and ask yourself, how do these set up the rest of the book? That's a good exercise to do. Let me just say something about chapter 3 then as well. Again, chapters 1 and 2 serves as kind of the official prologue. 3 does jump forward to the time of John the Baptist, but I'm including it here because the way Luke structures things, not only does he introduce John the Baptist for us, but then he shows us Jesus' baptism in 3:21, and then he gives us a genealogy in 3:23 through the end of chapter 3 in verse 38. You may recall that Matthew begins his book with a genealogy. Luke really ends his introduction with a genealogy, a very long one in both cases. And as I said when we discussed Matthew, genealogies are very, very important. Not only are they all over Genesis and in Chronicles and other places in the Bible, but they're essential for a good biographical retelling, because the question you're always asking the person I'm about to read about, who is he? Who is his origin? What is she about? Or what is he? Who were his parents and his ancestors? What were they like? That's an important bit of information for any biography. The big difference that's obvious between Luke's genealogy and Matthew's is that Matthew's genealogy sets out Jesus as being the son of David and the son of Abraham, and he includes that emphasis on the return from exile or the Babylon. For Luke, in accord with his much more universal sort of portrayal of what the gospel's about, he gives us a genealogy that goes from Joseph all the way back to Adam. And I think this is a more clearly Hellenistically situated biography, in the sense that Luke's scope and what he wants to explain is that this biography subject that he's about to write about, Jesus, has his origins that you can trace all the way back to the beginning of the Jewish story with Adam, not just to Abraham and David, but all the way back to Adam itself, which is part of the new creation. Jesus is the second Adam theme that Paul certainly talks about, and that I think we'll see Luke does as well, especially at the end of his gospel.